Well, hello and welcome to this edition of the Religion Hurts podcast. I am Mike Harrison, and I'm excited to have you here with me today. If you can't tell, I'm in my truck once again. It has been that way for a few days, a few podcasts in a row if you've been following, because I've been working a little more out of town, and I don't to get the podcast done. I've not been able to do it at the studio at home. I've been doing it out on the road while I am building an addition for a good friend who had some physical tragedy last year, and we're just getting an addition built for him, so he's got the ability to get in and out of his house. So we're live on location once again. Last week, I accidentally overheated my phone in the middle of the podcast, and I had to pause it and restart. Now it turns out that the video didn't actually take, and I had to redo the video a second time. But in the process, I learned that having the windows closed in my truck, and even with the AC on, unless I want it blowing nonstop, it got a touch hot in the truck last time and caused the phone to overheat that I'm recording on. And so this week, I am sitting here with windows open in the shade, got a nice breeze blowing through. But if you get a little bit of extra sound coming in, that's what it is today. I've got my son who is actually doing a little bit of cleanup on the job site right now, and as well as with the windows open, you might be able to hear some birds chirping and singing in the background. You might even see some white flowers blowing by as it's full bloom here today in Minnesota. So, but I'm excited to have you here. Last week it was a big long podcast, and if you missed it, go check it out. I believe that was episode 9. This is episode 10, and the whole podcast last week was getting into who ran the cult, what the cult was, everything. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about more in detail about how we ended up there, and kind of those steps and what happened and how things went early on. And that's what I'm going to get into this week. And I will try to keep it a little shorter than last week's. Last week's was 36 minutes, I think, give or take, due to just trying to get all that information out. It's hard to start and stop on something like that. So, and so let's without further ado, let's dive in. So when my wife and I got married, we got married in North Dakota, just where she's from, and I'm from Canada. I had moved down to North Dakota, and we discussed we were only married a few months, and she really wanted to go to beauty school and become a nail technician. And so we had moved to the cities. I think I got into some of all this, but just for a quick refresher, we had moved to the cities, and by the cities I mean Minneapolis, St. Paul. Also, I will apologize. Every once in a while, there's going to be a car that goes by. You're going to get that nice little whoom noise, so apologize for that. But work with me, and we'll keep it as minimal as we can. But so we had moved to Burnsville, was the actual city, was just south of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So if you're from Minnesota, everybody just calls it the cities. But we lived in Burnsville, Minnesota, and then eventually we bought a home in Farmington, Minnesota, and we lived here for roughly 4 years at that time, and then we had our first son, KJ, and he was less than a year old, and we moved back to North Dakota, decided we wanted to kind of be there, and I did construction working for myself in Minnesota, and then did the same thing in North Dakota, and then eventually, after a year or two of doing that, I took over as project manager for my father-in-law, working for phone companies, doing a bunch of turning homes over from copper onto fiber systems, and I became the project manager for a large contract that he had, which the work was great, but I got into some of the stuff with the relationship with my father-in-law and what I was hoping he would be, and no blame at him, just I was getting into a bad spot. And towards the end of that time, we were going to a really small church called Island Lake Chapel. It was right across the road from my in-laws' home, and it was just 3 or 4 families typically. And I had become kind of the de facto worship leader, meaning that I was the one leading worship, and it wasn't necessarily a, hey, can you do, originally was, can you do this Sunday or can you do a couple Sundays? But there just wasn't a lot of options with 4 families, so that's what I mean by de facto. It just kind of was something that became my responsibility. And so I was leading worship at church there, and we had a couple, Stephen and Nita, that were kind of doing the pastoring, but they weren't from the area, and they were from Beulah, North Dakota, which is quite a ways away, and they were up actually working originally on the cruise that I was project managing for. And eventually they ended up moving on and going back to Beulah. And before that, they asked me, would you have any interest in taking over the pastoring of this little church? And I think I talked about it in a future video. I had no clue what I was doing. I had no business doing it. Should never have ever said yes. But I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. And so for 6 months-ish, somewhere in there, I started pastoring this little church. Well, I was kind of desperate to figure it out and what to do and how to do things. I mean, I never spoke on a Sunday morning really before. I never really ran a church service. Had no idea what a church, governance or any of that stuff was supposed to look like. It was way over my head. It was during that time frame. My brother had gone to Ontario. I got into the whole thing about Chris and Brenda and their encounters in the last video. And my brother and my uncle, who owned a construction business together in Manitoba, that I used to be part of, before I moved away, it was our family construction business. Don Van Bodegum and my uncle Hank were really close friends. And so Don and Hank were talking on the phone one night, and Don said, we went to this encounter with Chris and Brenda. We're starting to do this small group. You guys should come check it out. So Hank and his wife Liz and my brother and his wife, so my brother's name is Chris, and his wife Elaine, they all flew out to Ontario, and they went to a weekend-long encounter with Chris and Brenda. And they did this encounter, and my brother, when he got back, he called me on the phone one day and started talking to me and telling me all about this encounter. And he said, Mike, this is the most amazing thing I ever went through. I got some freedom from some stuff having to do with some of the damage and hurts that Dad did to us and some different things. My dad was still alive at this time, but you really should check it out. And honestly, as a gift to you, I would pay for you to go. I'll pay for your tickets. I'll pay for you to go. I just, you're my brother. I love you, and I'd love to see you and Christy go to this. At the same time, he paid for my parents to go and for a couple other family members to go to this encounter. And so I was pretty desperate to figure out, like I said, how to be a pastor at that time. Plus, I think I also mentioned in earlier videos, I wasn't sleeping at all real well during this time frame. I'd go kind of days without sleeping. The only way I'd fall asleep was drinking. And so I had this understanding. I mean, I didn't know much about trying to be a pastor, but I had enough of an understanding to know that, hey, drinking to go to sleep and trying to be a pastor, probably something not quite right, but I didn't really know what to do. So we decided to go to this encounter, my wife and I. And we went out and went to this encounter, got to meet Chris and Brenda. Never experienced such a intentional kindness and love from people ever. We got there on a Friday. We went to the small group with Don and his wife and Chris and Brenda. I think it was Lisa was her name. I could be wrong on that. It's been a long time since I've seen her for sure. We went to the small group with Don and Lisa and Chris and Brenda. And it was really, really cool small group. And then from there, but from the moment I stepped into that small group, Chris Harrison made me feel like I was literally the most important person in the world. And into a person that's never had, that's always just struggled with feeling not loved, not cared about, not whatever. It was the most incredible feeling in the world to just feel that important all of a sudden. And, I had no idea that was the beginning of a grooming process, of course, but that was my first experience with him. Like, this man has a kindness and genuineness and love to him that I've never experienced from anybody. This is unbelievable. And Christy felt incidentally the same way about Brenda. And so we had this encounter, and it was separate. So Christy was with Brenda during the whole day, and I was with Chris during the whole day, just one-on-one like that. My word, what a very interesting experience, but it was really a very fascinating experience. And maybe I'll get more into the encounter some other time. But this is something that was put on by Catch the Fire and was well scripted and done. It was a really fascinating thing to just go through some hurts and some secrets and some things that were really there, and then to get prayer for, and then to feel heard, and then to feel like, this abuse that I'd gone through as a kid and as a teenager, and the feeling suicidal and the not being able to sleep and all these different things. I mean, just the freedom that came from being able to share this finally with somebody, what I was going through was so incredibly therapeutic. And then to feel the sense of zero judgment and an incredible amount of love from somebody in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Now, I didn't know it would lead to manipulation and destruction, but at the time it was everything that I needed to see and hear and go through. And so we did this, and then we went to Toronto Airport Church on Sunday, and then we flew home Sunday afternoon. We just had this incredible experience. We're living out in North Dakota at the time. And I went back thinking, okay, now I've gone through this, and I can kind of take some stuff back to the church. And I learned really quick that this wasn't going to work, me being a pastor at this little church. By then it was my father and mother-in-law, me and my wife, and another couple. And those that couple, my father and mother-in-law, and this couple, they didn't like each other. They didn't see eye to eye. And I get up to preach, and nobody had any interest in what I had to say, and I don't blame them. And I was just like, very quickly, like, this isn't a good idea. This isn't a good way to go. And so I very quickly said, hey, look, I tried to do it for a little bit, like I said I would, but this isn't me. And so I just, I said, I'll do a couple more Sundays and I can preach here and there, but this isn't really a good thing. And they kind of agreed, and so we did it for a little while longer, but we all kind of in the whole church, just the three families, said, look, this doesn't really make sense to keep doing this. And so we did a few more meetings, but it just, didn't make a lot of sense. And we didn't really keep the church going for very long after. And I would say I probably felt a little like a failure there, and I definitely felt some disappointment from my father-in-law, because I think he had wanted it to work. And even if he wasn't disappointed in me, I definitely felt like he was. And then, of course, I had gotten into, in a previous episode, during this time, my dad, who was already really sick, my dad, Neil, ended up having to go into for an emergency to a hospital in Roseau, just across the border from where he lived, because his lungs were collapsing. And they were able to get him okay, but they said, you're in bad shape, Neil. You need a lung transplant. You're not going to live much longer. And so let me back up on one thing. So I don't remember exactly how long it was from the time that we went to the encounter to the time this happened with my dad, but somewhere after we had gone to our encounter, Christy and I, and that weekend, my brother and his wife, so Christy and Elaine, and then my uncle Hank and his wife Liz, they decided that they wanted to sell their construction business and move out to Ontario. Neither one really liked construction. They were both kind of, my dad had started the construction business, and when he got real sick, my brother and uncle took it over, and I had moved away, and they really wanted something different for their lives. And Don owned a company that did mortgages for people, and so he offered Hank a kind of a project management role, because Don owned a lot of businesses, and to help with all of his businesses. And then he offered Chris a job doing mortgages, and they'd be able to sell their construction company, get a bunch of money off of that, and then additionally go get these jobs in Ontario that were really high earning jobs. And so they had both had taken Don up on that offer and had gone out to Ontario at this point. And then they had been out there for probably 3, 4, 5 months out there when my dad got this news about his lungs. And so at that point, my dad decided that, okay, yes. So they met with a specialist and said there's 2 places you can get a lung transplant in Canada. One's in Vancouver and the other one is in Toronto. So now my brother had moved out to Toronto with his wife, and Hank had moved out there. So my dad obviously picked going out to Toronto, and his parents were he's still living out close to Toronto. My mom's mom was still living out close to Toronto, and so and then her sisters. So they all decided to move out. My parents decided to move out to Toronto. So now, and then I had a sister that was going through a nasty divorce, pretty close to this time. And she decided to move out to be close to my parents and my brother as well. And so now one brother, a sister, my parents, everybody's living in Ontario. Just one sister was left in Manitoba, and us. And everybody else was gone. And so we decided... So then my dad's living out there now, and it was quite some time. He ended up, now I'm not pastoring anymore. I'm just working as a project manager, and, things seem okay. We had gone through the encounter, and that was good. But, this is kind of, life is getting a little bit worse in some ways. I'm not really, now I've got nothing to put myself to words other than work. I'm not really finding any kind of, anything that's giving me any satisfaction. That's how I felt at the time, any purpose, just working and kind of going through the motions. I got no other family around. My dad's getting sicker by the day, which is affecting me as far as, the not sleeping and different stuff. And then came the day that my dad, his lungs completely collapsed, and they brought him into the hospital. And I'm really sorry, I don't remember specific years and dates. And if Christy was here, she'd say, oh, that was this year and this date and this time, etc. I know that this is all before, it was probably right around 2010, because Ben was born in 2011 and he was born in Ontario. So we had gone there by that time. This is, a few months before all this. And so my dad gets brought in, his lungs have collapsed, and they put him on an iron lung, where essentially they take the blood out of his body, they cycle it through this black box, and they insert oxygen into his blood through this box, and it goes back into his body. And they kept him alive like this for a while, but they told us that, listen, the longest we've ever kept anybody alive on this has been 2 years. And so, 2 years, 2 weeks is what I meant to say. The longest we've ever kept anybody alive on this is 2 weeks. And so we don't know how long. He could go any moment. He needs lungs or he's gonna die. And so they moved him up to the top of the list, and he went about a week and a half. And during that week and a half, I didn't sleep at all. I don't know that I slept a wink during this whole time. And so finally we get the call. We're living in North Dakota. My wife and I get the call that, hey, your dad's going in for surgery for his lung transplant. And we decided at that point, let's get out. We decided we're either going to go to Ontario when he gets his lungs and go be there for my mom, or we're going to go, if he doesn't get his lungs and he passes, then we'll go for the funeral. But we just can't go and sit there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks until we know what's happening. So we just had kept contact with my mom on the phone through this time, and she calls, says, yep, he's getting his lungs and he's going into surgery. So we got up at like 4 a.m, got in our car, and literally drove whatever it was, 22 hours straight to Ontario. And we were there for 4 or 5 days, and got there, just after the lung transplant had ended, and got to see my dad. And what a horrific thing to see. His body was basically a skeleton with skin, and he had more tubes and wires going in and out of his body than I've ever seen. I can't even begin to describe how many tubes and hoses and things were coming in and out of his body. It was just incredible. And he had been cut, here down the breastbone and then down across down here. You could tell, and it was just all stitched back together. It was like a Frankenstein type thing. And he was, he was asleep. He never woke up while we were there that time, but we were there for 4 or 5 days. And during that time, which you can imagine how traumatic it was. I mean, I'm having my wrestles with still who my dad is at this point and all the things that had happened, but he's still my dad. And there's all these unsaid things and all this stuff that I kind of wanted there to be this relationship with. And I'm just struggling with all this. And we go and we spend some time we get invited to go out and see Chris and Brenda and go have breakfast with them, with my brother Chris and Hank and Chris and Brenda. And again, they never asked us for anything, never asked us for a cent, never tried to have any real connection with us, but they just were so kind. And again, it's all part of the grooming process, to bring down all your barriers and to bring you in. And grooming isn't something that happens generally very quick. It happens over time. And every time, for the first probably 10 times we saw Chris and Brenda, nothing but extremely kind, extremely uplifting. God's calling you to this. And they just speak, all these things into our lives, to the point that when we were ready to make a change in our life, the only thing we could think of is we got to go be where Chris and Brenda is, because this is how they see us, and everywhere else is dark. There's a one spot that we have in life, And so I'll try to fast forward through the tail end of this. We go back home to North Dakota. My dad ends up making it through all this, through the lung transplant. And it's probably a couple months after this, he decides to come visit us in North Dakota. And I remember getting to the airport. We went to Winnipeg to pick him up, because you can fly to Minot, North Dakota. That was an hour and a half from where we were living, but it's hard to do it. And so really at that time, best flights were Winnipeg, which is 3.5 hours away, or Minneapolis, which is 8 hours away. So, Winnipeg just made sense at 3.5 hours away. So I get to the Winnipeg airport, and I'm standing inside, and he walks off the plane. He's a little bit chubby because he just put some weight. He couldn't stop eating after all the time. He was so sick he could barely eat, could barely swallow food, because it would make him feel like he was going to suffocate, because he struggled so much to breathe. He got off the plane, and his face was a little bit round. He had some color for the first time in years. I remember him getting off, and he had these cream-colored cowboy boots, and I can remember everything about the experience. He'd come off. I've never in all my life seen my dad so happy to see me. I've just never had that experience. In that time, him coming to see me was incredible. And we spent 4 or 5 days. He came and stayed with us, and wow. He was the dad that he had never been up to that point, genuinely cared about me, genuinely cared about our son, genuinely cared about Christy, and none of this was put on. He definitely had a new lease on life and was just so happy to be around us and see us, and it was incredible. And anyway, there's more to the story of how we went from that to go, and I'll get into that, exactly how that next part went on the next video. But of course, he began to speak about, he was going to the group at this time. He really believed, my dad really truly believed, that his being alive had a lot to do with his connection to the group and my brother's connection to the group. And he was such a different man. Like, I look at it now and I understand he was a different man, because he basically died on the table and was given a second chance at life, and he just was embracing every moment of it. He lived for about a year longer, maybe a little bit longer than that, 1.5 years, after his lung transplant. No, I should say he was about a year of being really healthy, then he started getting sick again. And he was sick for almost another year before he died. So almost 2 years that he lived after the lung transplant. But that 1 year where he was healthy, wasn't even close to the same guy. So incredibly kind and genuine and loving. It was unbelievable. And, So he goes back to Ontario. My life is becoming darker and darker because I got nowhere to go, no place to call my own in a way. I'm desperate for some kind of somewhere to put my energy into other than just work. Feeling, still drinking like crazy. Just life is dark, completely addicted to pornography and things, and just feeling no hope. And we decide that we're going to go out to, so Reinhard Bonnke was actually his ministry that I work for now, Christ for All Nations, was having an impartation breakfast in Toronto. And my brother called me up and says, hey, we're going to go to this impartation breakfast. And the whole group is going to be there. And mom and dad and us, would you like to come out and come check this out? So Christy and I decided, let's go to this impartation breakfast. And we decided to go out there, and we decided we're going to go. We had just read, Reinhard Bonnke had wrote a book, and we read the book, Christy and I did, and then went out there and actually got to meet Reinhard Bonnke and Daniel Kalenda, who I now work for part-time. We got to go meet them and be at this breakfast, and they just called it an impartation breakfast, but generally it just meant that they would share what they were doing with their thing and about evangelism, and then they'd pray for people at the breakfast, and that's the impartation part, the idea that they could pass on some of their giftings and what he's doing in their life onto us. And the breakfast was great. But again, we got to see my dad and see my brother, and all we're hearing is all the victories happening in their life, all that's good. Right around this time is when Don had gotten busted with all the illegal things that he was doing. And so they were telling us about how Chris Harrison had found this out and was a prophet. And all we're hearing all this time is all the great that's happening in this group, and how lives are being changed. And my dad's a completely different person, and how that was coming from Chris Harrison's prayer and some prophecy that he had, and all these things. And at home, life is getting darker, and here everything seems great. So again, this is another experience, another grooming experience. Again, all the kindness. This time we went and spent time with them at the farm where they were living in the camper, and I remember thinking, like, how can somebody that's living in this camper be blessed of God? When all we ever say is the people that are rich are blessed of God. And I think for us, it did something completely, because now we watched as Don Van Bodegum had been giving them some funding and some vehicles and some different things, and in a spur of a moment, he ripped everything away from them. Everything they'd been doing to sponsor what they were doing with horse racing and everything, ripped it all away. And yet God seemed to make this way. And Hank and Chris went from having these great jobs to having nothing because Don got busted for all this fraud, and which I know they were never part of, but they lose their jobs, and yet God seemed to be able to pick up the pieces and bring them some hope and some life and some different things. And it's like, oh, cool, God's blessed them in spite of this. And that's when we went through the experience of finding out. Shortly after that is when we ended up making our choice to go to the cult and doing all that. And that's what I'll get into specifically the next video, is the days when we left and what happened, how we ended up at the cult, and kind of the whole trip and the move and everything I will get into next time. So thank you so much for joining me on this edition of the Religion Hurts podcast. I'm so blessed that you chose to join me and spend this time with me. Thank you so much, and I just pray that God blesses you and you have a great week. All right, thank you so much.